Welcome to all our viewers, all our listeners from all parts of the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, of course, and all parts of the diaspora and on the continent. We welcome you to this, the third session in the 25th anniversary of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And if you had joined us on any of the previous ones, you'll know that our theme this year is the movement for decolonization continues. And we are stressing on the issues of decolonization. Why? Because we feel it is an unfinished project, both locally and globally. And we remind ourselves that Kwame Ture gave us some definitions about imperialism. And one of the things he said is that it was the main threat to human rights, social justice, and racial equality. So today, having looked and explored the issues of what's happening to our brothers and sisters in Haiti at our launch with Dr. Jemima Pear, and then last week, exploring how the issues of Palestine were emerging and the suffering that our brothers and sisters in Palestine are undergoing in their search to end decolonization and their struggles against what has been described by the International Court of Justice as genocide. We are now exploring the issues of reparations. So today we have with us Ambassador David Commission from the government of Barbados, who's the ambassador to the CARICOM. And we have with us Dr. Claudius Fergus, who is chair of the National Reparations Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. And out of London, we have Mr. Robin Walker. So we expect a very interesting discussion. I must apologize for Dr. Marlene Atz. Unfortunately, today she was not at her best of health and asked to be excused. So let me just introduce the topic of reparations that we're going to be talking about. Our topic was reparations and the challenge of underdevelopment. What's the deal? In fact, are we moving forward? Are we at a standstill? What's happening? That's what today's discussion will be all about. But before I introduce and bring our speakers on, let me just share with you that what will happen is that each speaker will present for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and comments, and we look forward to you putting your questions in the chat, whether you're joining us on Facebook or on YouTube or even on the CPAN Facebook page. Now, what I think is interesting and exciting is that this very week, just on the 18th of June, I'm not sure if you are aware that the Harvard University School of Public Policy published a very, very interesting discussion, one of their research policy documents looking at fairness and justice. And they published a document that actually suggests, it's called Normalizing Reparations. And they suggest that in their research that the government of America has been very often involved in engaging in reparations for different issues, and they've paid reparations quite comfortably. They just have not done so for African Americans. This is what the Harvard study suggests. And they said that government has, throughout its history, in addition to cash stipends, and I'm quoting them here now, their research, they say our research, shows compensation and benefits to victims come in several forms, and they highlight some of those. They said the federal government has been creative in devising compensation, such as health care guarantees, tax rebates, education, housing, training, and relocation. And they said that there has been no shortage of the federal government. They say they've been creative in devising compensation for harm. They just have not done so for African Americans. So let's see what our specialists on today's program are going to tell us about how this movement for reparations is progressing. And in fact, can we expect to be able to address the challenges which underdevelopment has laid before us? What's happening? What's the deal? So I give you first Ambassador David Commission. Welcome to the the Kwame Ture lecture series.
Yes. Thank you, Asha. It's a pleasure to be here, and I am sure that Kwame Ture would have approved of the topic of today's discussion. Kwame Ture was famous for defining Pan Africanism as the liberation and unification of Africa under the principles of scientific socialism. So, in his approach to reparations, I have no doubt he would have zeroed in on the issue of underdevelopment and reparations as a tool for addressing underdevelopment. You know, it might be good for us to begin with a legal definition of reparations because we always have to stress that when African people claim reparations, we are making a claim in morality and ethics, yes, but even more importantly, in international law. So let's begin with the definition. The legal basis for reparations was set out in the well known international law case, the factory at Chaozhou, in which the Permanent Court of International Justice, this is the predecessor to today's International Court of Justice, stated, and I quote, it is a principle of international law that the breach of an engagement involves an obligation to make reparation in an adequate form. Reparation must, as far as possible, wipe out all the consequences of the illegal act and re-establish the situation which would, in all probability, have existed if that act had not been committed. End of quote. This principle is reflected in Article 31 of the International Law Commission's articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts. And that article provides that the responsible state is under an obligation to make full reparation for the damage caused by by internationally wrongful conduct. End of quote. So, if we look at the historical phenomena for which people of Africans and people of African descent are today claiming reparations, we can go to the work of a number of our scholars who really helped us to lay out the basis for reparations. I guess perhaps one of the foundational works would be Dr. Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, and he made the point about the whole process of slavery being central to the development of capitalism. But we could even drill down a bit deeper because we have works like Walter Rodney, whom his How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And in his work, he makes the point that Europe's development was purchased at the price of the systematic looting, plundering of Africa, looting, plundering of Africa's human resource, the plundering of Africa's mineral resource, and the systematic underdevelopment of Africa. Then we have Hilary Beckles, and he makes a similar case for the Caribbean. His major work, How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean, and he lays out in great detail how Britain's colonial control of the Caribbean over centuries, Britain's use of slavery, the enslavement of our African ancestors, the systematic looting and plundering of generations of our African ancestors. They were not able to keep or appropriate or enjoy any of the fruits of their labor, all of the fruits of their labor, siphoned off the European families and European companies, European institutions, and ultimately to the capitals and governments of Europe. So again, Britain's development purchased at the price of the systematic plundering and underdevelopment of the Black people of the Caribbean. And then we have Manning Marvel, who similarly looks at the African American experience in his major work, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. So we can go to our scholars to help us to get a good understanding of how African and African diaspora societies went through centuries long processes of looting and plundering of their resources and having the development being stymied and being enmeshed in a situation of underdevelopment, whilst the nations and peoples that committed those crimes benefited from the unjust enrichment, developed wealthy, opulent industrial civilizations. And when we in the Caribbean community came to launch our reparations claim in the year 2013, we, perhaps unlike some other African people who, you know, launched reparations claim, we did not think so much in terms of reparations as individual cash payments or individual compensation packages. We thought more collectively. We thought more in terms of underdevelopment and reparations being an instrument to address the systematic underdevelopment that has been inflicted upon us. So when you look at, for example, the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparative justice, really the 10 demands, and we are talking about uh, measures to address the educational deficit, measures to address the public health deficit, technology transfer, debt cancellation. Um, you can see that it is not about individual, in a sense, individual compensation. It is more about a collective approach to dealing with our collective condition. And so the conception of reparations that we have favored could, in a sense, be defined as reparations being the process of addressing and redressing the historical legacies of underdevelopment that are directly linked to the crimes of African enslavement and native genocide. I know we are basically focusing on African enslavement in this talk, but of course, the CARICOM reparations claim is also for the native genocide and the systematic underdevelopment that was inflicted upon the indigenous people of, of the Caribbean. So if we, another way to think about it, another way to think about it is when we look back on those centuries of systematic looting and plundering of our resources, um, stymieing our development, favoring, benefiting the wealth accumulation and the development of Europe and North America, and creating a world political and economic order in which those nations that were guilty of that criminality have created a world order in which they have assumed a position of dominance and the black and brown nations and peoples of the world that were subjected to those crimes and those centuries of systematic underdevelopment have been inserted in this world order in in still what amounts to a structurally um, subservient and still exploitative condition. And so reparations could also be conceived of the fact that because of that history, because of that criminality and that injustice and that looting and systematic looting and plundering, we, the nations, the black and brown nations and people of the world who were the victims of that criminality, we now have a fundamental and inalienable right to development, and those nations and structures and institutions who were historically guilty of the criminality are under a corresponding duty to facilitate that development. This is another way of looking at it. And so when we think of when we think of reparations in that light, we can immediately see that reparations is a tool for revamping, restructuring, deconstructing, and revamping the currently existing international economic and political order. So reparations is a very creative concept. I mean, we can think of it in terms of um, the crimes that were committed against our ancestors, and the fact that we can calculate um, the damage caused by those crimes, and we can present, in a sense, we can present a bill to our the former enslaver nations for those crimes. So reparation being compensation for the crimes and the damage that emanated from those crimes. But it can also go beyond that. It can also go beyond that to say that reparations demands that the currently existing international economic and political order, which still holds us, our nations, in a structurally exploitative manner, must be radically reformed and restructured. And I think it is fair to say that if we look at how our reparations campaign in the Caribbean, under the Caribbean community, has evolved over the past 11 years, I think it is fair to say that over the past 5 years or so, this more internationalist dimension of our reparations claim has more and more come to the fore. And I think some of the credit for that, or a lot of the credit for that, goes to Prime Minister Mayor Amor Motley, who assumed chairmanship of the CARICOM Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations in 2018. And and so in addition to the traditional claim for reparations that CARICOM levied against the UK, France, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, and Holland back in 2016, CARICOM actually wrote to the heads of government of these countries back in 2016, making a traditional type of reparations claim against them. But since then, we have seen the development of this other dimension of our reparations claim, where, for example, we are demanding the restructuring of the major international organizations. We are making the case that whether it's the United Nations, whether it's for example, the Security Council. The Security Council is a bastion, basically, of white power, in that the permanent members, the 5 permanent members, are dominated by the white countries of the world. So we are making a case for restructuring of the international institutions. We are making a case for the restructuring of the terms of international trade. We are making a case now for the restructuring of inequitable rules of international finance, restructuring of the rules and practices of international economic governance. And most importantly, we are making a big case for compensation for climate injustice. And we're using the reparations principle. We are saying that these countries, these wealthy industrialized European countries, enslaved our ancestors, looted and plundered our ancestors, used the fruits of our ancestors' labor to build these industrial economies, which went on to create the greenhouse gases that caused the global warming that we, black and brown nations, especially those in the Caribbean, we are now feeling the negative effects of that. And so we are making a case for compensation for the climate injustice. That is reparations. The reparations. I think my time is up, but just to kind of summarize the argument I'm making, I'm saying that we need to deploy the principle and concept of reparations in a very creative way. We need to do it in the traditional way of claiming compensation for the looting and the crimes committed against our ancestors, but we also must not ignore the international economic and political order that has its roots in those centuries of enslavement and systematic criminality against our people. And the reparations concept must be applied to restructuring that critical environment as well. And we can all bring it back to the two definitions that I gave. Reparations being the effort to redress historical legacies of underdevelopment that are directly linked to the crime of African enslavement. And secondly, that the history that we are complaining about has bestowed upon us, the black and brown nations and people, a fundamental right to development, and upon the oppressor nations, those guilty of the historical crimes, a fundamental obligation to facilitate that development. Let me end there. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, David. This is an interesting presentation that David has given us here to start the ball rolling, because he puts it in a very wide, what shall I say, a very wide perspective, looking at the international order and suggesting that through challenging and calling for our reparations, we can in fact, and we do in fact, call for the reconstruction and the deconstructing in our minds and understanding of the global economic order, international economic order. So we've got lots to talk about there, David. Lots of questions come up as you raise these issues. And I'm going to introduce our second speaker to hear his take on these issues of reparations. And of course, he's coming from a different perspective because he's living in Europe. He resides in the UK. So we're very curious to understand how is the argument for reparations progressing in the UK and in Europe generally. So let me welcome to our program now, Mr. Robin Walker. And Robin, how are you?
Very, very well. Very, very well, ma'am. Very well.
Good. Okay, great. Nice to have you. And I know it's late on your side of the water, but we're happy that you could be joining us still.
Thank you very much. When it comes to the issues of reparations, I take a slightly different perspective to a lot of people, and I'm going to explain that difference. Most of us, when we talk about reparations, we talk about numbers of victims multiplied by the unpaid wages over hundreds and hundreds of years. We talk about the false imprisonment of our enslaved African ancestors and how much, if you put somebody through false imprisonment, what would be the compensation, and multiply that by the number of victims. We talk about the unjust enrichment. How much did this unjust enrichment add to the economies of Britain, the economies of France, the economies of Spain, Portugal, etc., etc., etc.? And when you add all that up at compound interest, it opened up a wealth gap between them and us of many, many, many trillions. That's the standard way that most people look at reparations. And it's a valid way, but I'm going to put a slightly different spin on the issue. You see, we have to recognize that those Africans that were captured and enslaved brought skills, brought wealth, brought intellectual capacity to the Western world. And no one really talks about this. There's a very important book here, and it's called Pre-Colonial African Material Culture. And it was written by an African-American professor, Professor Vincent Taraku Farrar. And he talks about the transfer of technology from Africa to the Western world during mass enslavement, including the technologies of metallurgy, the technologies of being a mechanic, the technologies of being a miner, the technologies of carpentry, boat building, cotton technologies, as well as farmers. You see, a lot of people were under the impression that our contribution to the Western Hemisphere was strictly as farmers. No, it's all these other areas as well. And therefore, when it comes to the intellectual development, we are contributors to that. And that has never been recognized, and that has never been factored into what needs to be said when we are dealing with reparations. So, for example, a controversial paper came out a couple of years ago by an English scholar, Dr. Jenny Bulstrode, and she talked about the role that 76 enslaved metallurgists in Jamaica contributed to something that has gone down in history as the CORT process, C-O-R-T process. And that's about reusing scrap metal and turning scrap metal into high-grade metal. And this was one of the important things in the evolution of the Industrial Revolution. And those 76 enslaved metallurgists in Jamaica deserve to get shine in history, but instead those contributions have been attributed to Henry Court, when indeed it should have been to the 76 enslaved Jamaicans. And that's important because what it shows is the example of intellectual transfer from Africa to the Americas. And that needs to be a part of the discussion. How much money did the Henry Court process generate for the British economy? And again, that's a very important area. We all know about the legendary Mary Seacole, and she, in Jamaica, using West African medical ideas and technologies, she was able to claim she never lost a mother or a child when it came to childbirth. The use of superfoods. She is one of the pioneers of superfoods, also in the suppression of a cholera epidemic. And those skills, those intellectual developments are coming from African intellectual traditions that, again, most people don't speak of. There's the very famous example of Wanzimus, the enslaved African in Boston in the United States, whose technologies, again, coming straight from Africa, involving the technique that precedes vaccination. It's called the inoculation techniques, in how you suppress the spread of smallpox. So the smallpox vaccine, and that is essentially how vaccination spread in the Western world. It starts from an enslaved African bringing those ideas, bringing that technology from Africa. And again, this is something that is hardly ever recognized. Again, another African American example is we think of Jack Daniel's whiskey and not realize that the master distiller who came up with the formula was another enslaved African. His name was Nathan Nearest Green. And consequently, why are we even calling this thing Jack Daniels? So when it comes to then the intellectual that enslaved people brought, many of us grew up on folk tales that are of African origin, such as Anansi and so on. And another body of those folk tales are the Brer Rabbit stories. And the Brer Rabbit stories were first, if you like, published and made into something by Joel Chandler Harris. And he was a European American who profited from that. And he called them the Uncle Remus stories. And those same stories were plagiarized again by somebody in England called Beatrice Potter, who turned Brer Rabbit into Peter Rabbit and made millions. The Peter Rabbit stories are still on sale today, having gone through umpteenth reprints and reprints and reprints. Did enslaved Africans, who are the people who created those stories, did they receive anything? In fact, is there even an acknowledgement that the Brer Rabbit, Peter Rabbit, and for that matter, Bugs Bunny stories originated as African folk tales? And how much did we lose by them not being recognized as such? When it comes to what enslaved Africans brought to the Western world, even when it comes to areas of intangible heritage, one of my areas of research is in music, another area is in dance, where on plantations in America, there were the 4 plantation dances that the African Americans did: the turkey trot, the bunny hug, the grizzly bear, and the camel walk. And then when this was ripped off, it then became the foxtrot, which is one of the ballroom dances we have today. Black people in Buenos Aires are the ones that took the tango from Central Africa. It's a Central African word, by the way. And then by the time we get to Black people being brought to Buenos Aires as enslaved people, that becomes the dance, the tango. Black Cubans are the people that were responsible for the rumba. The cha-cha-cha is also a Black Cuban dance. The African Americans produced the jive. And so a lot of the ballroom dances that we have today, in fact, 2/3 of them are actually of Black origins. Does anyone talk about this? Does anyone talk about, well, perhaps Black people should get some shine because it's their dances that are being put out there? So the main point that I want to make is when we are factoring in mass enslavement, don't just think of it as numbers of plantation people multiplied by unpaid wages, numbers of enslaved people multiplied by false imprisonment, numbers of enslaved people multiplied by the unjust enrichment and then compound it, equaling trillions. We also have to factor in the fact that African intellectual contributions that have also generated millions, and we should also compound for those millions too. And at some point, that needs to be a part of the discussion. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Walker. Robin, I think that's a very interesting take on this discourse on reparations. And yes, we've been some of us have been able to keep abreast of some of these things that are now being exposed, such as the work on the metallurgy. So thank you for bringing that right to the attention of all our listeners. I can see that this is going to be a very interesting discussion when we open the floor for our 3 guests to engage with our audience. And now, before I do that, though, I'm going to bring our last speaker in, who is not a stranger to people in Trinidad and Tobago and in Ghana, where he's taught for many years, and even in the UK. But this is, of course, our own Dr. Claudius Fergus, author and now chair of the Trinidad and Tobago National Reparations Committee. So it gives me great pleasure to bring Dr. Fergus in as a historian on this panel to bear. Go ahead, Doctor. The floor.
Thank you, my sister. Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm motivated by two seminal works, and one of them already mentioned. These focused on different shores of the Atlantic. Now, these two works were published the same year in 1972, and they are the Ghanese historian, Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. David already introduced that work, but I also was motivated by that of Jamaican economist George Beckford, Persistent Poverty, Underdevelopment in Plantation Economies of the Third World. I recognize development as a colonialist imperialist construct. The highest GDP and income per capita qualify certain economies and peoples as quote-unquote developed. Other economies and peoples come in as developing or third world and underdeveloped. Now, most so-called developed countries have masses of people living in poverty or barely surviving above the poverty line. In other words, within a developed country, many people exist in third world or underdeveloped conditions. Reparatory justice is not new. It has merely gained new momentum. As early as 1787, Black abolitionist Otto Cogwano offered the earliest argument for reparations in Britain. Cogwano was a Fanti of Ghana, modern-day Ghana, who had experienced slavery in Grenada and later emancipated in England. In his book, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species, in that book he argued that divine law requires an equal retaliation and restoration for every injury that men may do to others to show the greatness of the crime. However, he ruled out retaliation as having no value to the injured victim, and instead he recommended reparation. He actually used the word reparation. In the 1960s, Trinbagonian scholar Lloyd Bess and Canadian Carrie Levitt, both economists of the New World Group, became famous for applying the term plantation economy to the continued monocultural colonialist system of production. One of the salient features of this model was the post-colonial policy of depriving emancipated Africans of ownership of arable land while sanctioning draconian police laws to preserve the plantation status quo. Together with George Beckford, who was another New World intellectual, they envisaged that only the complete destruction of the plantation economy could transform the Caribbean from its inherited underdevelopment. But Beckford further emphasized that the first stage of transformation must be the revolution of the mind. 7 years later, Maurice Bishop, who was a student of Black Power, applied these ideas to create a model of reparatory governance to turn around Grenada's underdevelopment within 4 years. So we do have examples to look at. Kwame Ture, whom we honor in this panel discussion this afternoon, explains his shift from Black Power for African Americans to a broader-based Pan-Africanism. I quote him, "As we developed, we realized the struggle wasn't just against racism. It's a struggle for power, and power means land," unquote. In the United States of America, 40 acres and a mule as compensation for slavery challenged Britain's policy of systematic denial of access to land for emancipated Africans in the Caribbean. The distribution of 40 acres and a mule, however, lasted only 4 months. Lands already distributed were taken back, and emancipated Africans were again condemned to persistent poverty as plantation laborers. reparation was replaced by Jim Crowism, or the re-engineering of white supremacy, which actually created a new class of underdeveloped Africans, the chain gangs. The justification of 40 acres and a mule, however, lives on, and it climaxed in the U.S. Congress in 2021 when the House Judiciary Committee approved the reparations bill, H.R. 40, at 40, of course, referring to the 40 acres. And that bill was to create a commission on slavery and reparations. One of the stellar advocates for reparations in the U.S., Congresswoman Sheila Jackson, hailed the bill as the first step on the path to restorative justice for slavery and Jim Crowism. Only this week, as Sister Asher already mentioned, Harvard University published a report. One is a very long report, another one is published in the Science Journal. I'm referring to the one in the Science Journal titled Normalizing Reparations, U.S. Precedent, Norms, and Models for Compensating Harms and Implications for Reparations to Black Americans. The report, which was co-authored by Cornell Williams Brooks, a Black lawyer activist, and Linda Bilms, who is a wide public policy analyst. And the report claims that the federal government is the ideal authority to pay reparations. So as David would have said, the shift is towards that larger system of reparations. The state of California have been an interesting case that we have been following for some years now. And finally, it hopes to pass several reparations bills in August this year, but has already set aside $12 million to implement its reparatory measures. Jews, or rather Israelis, built the global power that they wield today on reparations to the survivors of the Holocaust. For Jews as a national entity, Israel was their 40 acres and a mule. Reparations transformed them from an underclass and pariah constituency across Europe and America to one of the highest economically developed countries today. Germany has already paid 80 billion in euros in reparations and continues to pay billions every year. The fate of South Africans is like that of African Americans. South Africans should have been paid reparations following the formal end of apartheid in 1994. Section 27 of the 1996 Constitution actually guaranteed appropriation and return of land stolen by whites under the Native Lands Act of 1913. CODESA, or the Council for a Democratic South Africa, was set up in 1991 to negotiate a transition out of apartheid. CODESA recognized the need for reparations for the victims of apartheid violence from 1960 to 1994. The law that created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission also established the Committee on Reparations and Rehabilitation, which submitted its report to President Nelson Mandela in 1998. The report recommended urgent affirmative action on education, health, and housing. But the government put the recommendations on hold until 2003, when monetary compensation was recommended to 22,000 individuals and their families. To manage the allocation, the government of Thabo Mbeki immediately established a presidential fund under the Ministry of Justice and Correctional Services. Nevertheless, payment was aborted before completion, leaving many victims without redress. Even as we speak, many protesters are camped outside the Constitutional Court as their last hope for justice. They argue that the system used was flawed and that millions of South Africans were actually affected by apartheid violence. The consequences of failure to put reparatory justice at the center of the post-apartheid project is a major contributor to the continuing underdevelopment of millions of Black South Africans. George Beckford believed that third world problems can only be solved by third world peoples. Recently, South African revolutionary fighter Ugogo Machiki lamented The medicine of the black elite is a white person. He was saddened by the frequency with which black elites desperately seek white approval and validation of transformative policies and affirmative programs. The reparations movement is not immune to this weakness and should guard against a phenomenon already manifested of apologists becoming over-influential as reparationists. Research remains critical to the advancement of reparations against the pushback of European governments. Respecting the recalcitrance and arrogance of the British government, ongoing research on the relationship of the monarch and the trafficking and enslavement of Africans might be a game changer. This is a privately funded research that was done by the University of Manchester by a PhD student to be completed in 2026. But we already know that the European monarchs were personally involved in controlling and profiting from the enslavement and traffic in Africans. Elizabeth I gave the pirate John Hawkins his new ship to transport trafficked Africans across the Atlantic to sell to Spanish colonists. King James I, who commissioned the translation of the Bible from Latin to English, which is still known as the King James Version, created the first monopoly company called the Guinea Company to traffic Africans to Virginia. His namesake, James II, was CEO of the Royal African Company, the biggest slave trading outfit before the 19th century. And the linkages continue down to the present king. Rodney explained, that's Walter Rodney, that when measuring the impact of European trafficking on Africans, it is first necessary to realize that one is measuring violence rather than trade in the moral sense of the word. The violence that was deployed against Africans to procure captured labor was the same violence that depopulated the Caribbean and created the reasons to exploit African labor. The violence to secure African captives robbed the continent of prime human resources in every imaginable way. It was not only agriculturists, as you heard from our brother Robin Walker, but miners, industrialists, traders, governing officials, religious leaders, artists, and scholars, both literate and oral. This violence stagnated Africa's population for centuries, disrupted ancient continental networks of commodity trades, and upended its industrial development, creating dependency on European manufacturers. Despite clear evidence for these drawbacks, the emphasis of the European Union's reparatory justice program is repatriation and restitution. And I believe one of the major reasons for this orientation is the popular belief that only Africans can solve Africa's problem of underdevelopment. The underdevelopment of the Caribbean began as early as 1492, before the establishment of African enslavement. Before European invasion, the Caribbean economy was intra-regionally self-sufficient. Within one generation, however, the population was decimated to near extinction, the region's resources plundered. Up to 1520, Spain's main source of gold was the Caribbean. Now let's put some figures to this. In the year 1518, the Spanish crown collected 120,000 ducats from the Caribbean. The ducat was a gold coin valued at $150 in today's value for gold. This means that the gold shipped through legal channels in 1518 alone was worth 18 million US dollars. We don't have a value for the pearls and other wealth extracted from using enslaved native labor. Because of time, I will select only one of CARICOM's 10-point plan of action to apply to our discourse on underdevelopment. Point 10. Point 10 of the plan calls for debt cancellation, which is expected to address the fiscal entrapment that faces Caribbean governments that emerged from slavery and colonialism. On the surface, debt cancellation should massively impact on the development of the region. However, there are two big catches that hinder this objective. Debt cancellation improves a country's international credit ratings, thus tempting the forgiven government to incur more debt. Nigeria is an excellent case in point. Under President Olusegun Obasanjo's regime, The Paris Club relieved the country of $18 billion. When he demitted office in 2007, the national foreign debt was $2 billion, down from $28 billion. In the second quarter of last year, the foreign debt stood at $43 billion. Most of this accumulated under President Muhammad Buhari from 2015 to 2023. Now, since poverty and unemployment increased exponentially under Buhari, the consensus is that Nigeria's debt cycle has more to do with bad governance than the legacy of the colonial economy. In the Caribbean, the questions must be asked. How would the savings from debt cancellation and all other monetary benefits translate into reparatory justice for the masses of Africans and First Peoples where applicable? Now, this is a different perspective to that explored by David, but of course we can discuss this in a short while. I submit that for reparations to undo the legacy of underdevelopment, what we need is to produce successive, enlightened, and visionary government leaders, such as Maurice Bishop and Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, supported by leaders of reparations organizations whose feet are grounded in the hopes and aspirations of the grassroots. Unless the masses are centered as beneficiaries of reparations in all its forms, defeating underdevelopment through reparations will remain a pipe dream. The African Union will set up an African reparations fund. CARICOM must do the same if the claims of the battle group reports are to be taken seriously. I end there for now, and we are going to be facing the floor in a while. I know my presentation was particularly different from that of David, but we are all independent thinkers in addition to belonging to the same organization, the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Fergus. You even reminded me how much I used to enjoy Beckford. You know, I hadn't thought about him for a long time, but certainly this is a good moment for us to dust off our Beckford books and go back and have another look at him. So this is quite interesting. I appreciated, and I'm sure our audience did as well, your reminder to us that in fact, it will take African people to solve African problems. In other words, it will take those people who are suffering the most to be able to solve their own problems. And this brings me to this, which none of our speakers actually addressed. So I'm going to raise this question first. I'm sorry, I'm taking the privilege of the chair to raise this question first. What about self-repair? I didn't hear any of our speakers address the issues of self-repair. And in fact, I would want to understand how are our governments faring in leading this charge of self-repair? Are we on track? And what grade would we give our governments for this? And what about, since we're at the close of the decade, for people of African descent, the United Nations declared decade for people of African descent. What have we done in terms of self-repair? And what needs to be done? There must be gaps. What else do we have to do? Because that self-repair issue, although I think Dr. Fergus did touch a little bit on it, talking about the leadership that has to bring us into development. But I would like to hear your opinions on issues of self-repair, what needs to be done both at the national level and at the individual level, at the grassroots level, what needs to be done. I'd be happy to hear some comments in that regard. And thank you all for really interesting and provocative presentations this afternoon. Anyone would like to start?
Yeah, I would start. We always have to be careful with this concept of self-repair. There are too many of us characterize Black people as damaged people. And we have to be very, very careful with that notion that somehow we are a damaged people. The reality is that all people that experience trauma are marked by that trauma in some way. But if we look at our historical experience, African people did extremely well. African people were brought across the Atlantic and placed in these, what they call locations of barbarism, evil slave societies. And somehow we were able to protect our basic humanity. We were able by our resistance, our not just physical resistance, but also cultural resistance, to create of these barbaric locations um, human nurturing spaces. And so even though we acknowledge that, we are not superhuman beings, like all other people, we are trauma marks us in some way, but we have to be careful not to give the impression that somehow we are some uniquely damaged people. In fact, I would probably argue that the Europeans who committed those crimes have been more damaged by that experience of criminality. And there are all kinds of social pathologies in Europe today that can be traced right back to those centuries. So yes, self-repair is a legitimate part of reparations. We have a duty to examine ourselves, to examine our psyches, to examine our culture, and wherever we discern any vestiges of notions of black inferiority and white superiority, we have to identify them, and we have to address them. We have to extirpate them. But part of the self repair has to do with seeing Europe and European culture in a correct perspective. Europe has played this con game of seeking to portray their culture as the pinnacle of achievement and civilization. And some of us have bought into that idea. But if we truly examine it, we recognize that what they put forward as this great achievement was actually built on criminality, was built on genocide, was built on all kinds of terrible crimes. And so we have to deconstruct that myth of European superiority and the superiority of European culture. And another part, an associated part of that myth has to do with issues of development. We we haven't been plundered and looted for centuries. We embarked upon our journey as independent nations, and we're told, "Oh, lift yourself up now. You're now independent. Lift yourself up by your own bootstrap." And we had to try to develop our societies in a very hostile and unhelpful and in fact destructive international environment. Now, compare a Caribbean government with, for example, the government of the United States. The government of the United States just has to print money. It wants to do something, it just prints the money. It doesn't have to worry. It doesn't have to worry about balance of payments and going to the international financial system to negotiate a loan and to negotiate interest payments, and when you have to pay back, and what debt to GDP ratio you have to maintain. That has been our reality, over the whole course of independence. So, placed in that context, we have done relatively well. We really are a miracle people. We are people who have really built something literally out of nothing, out of very little. But the good news is, and you asked if self-repair is advancing. The good news is that yes, one aspect of self-repair advancing is that whereas we bought into that rigged game, we accepted the bona fides of that rigged game back in the 60s and so forth, we see it clearly now for what it is. And we are now making demands, Claudius. So we're not only demanding debt cancellation, but we are now saying that the international financial institutions now need, when they are making development loans to black and brown developing countries that went through centuries of enslavement and exploitation, we need 30 to 50-year development loans. In other words, we recognize that just as Britain, when Britain went through the First World War and accumulated massive debt because of that war, Britain was given 100 years to pay off that debt. When Germany was devastated by the Second World War and Germany had to undertake debt to rebuild, they wrote in clauses into the German debt that Germany was only required to pay a very small percentage of debt of their GDP in debt payments. In other words, the system recognized that white countries that the conditions that are conducive to development are guaranteed by the system to white countries. Whereas black countries that came out of centuries of exploitation, none of that was given to us. And they said to us, oh, you have to be responsible and you have to operate within these narrow parameters and pull yourself up by your bootstrap. Well, we have seen through that now. So, for example, we have seen, and incidentally, let me mention that we have something called the Bridgetown Initiative. The Bridgetown Initiative is a complex of demands that were put together in Barbados in July, August 2022. And they're basically demands for the restructuring of the international economic order to make it much more conducive to our development. So we are saying, for example, that in all of the debt instruments, we must have debt pause clauses so that if we are hit by a natural disaster like a hurricane, there's a pause on the debt payments for 2 years to give us that breathing space, to rather than having to pay debt to recover. We are talking now about 100 million that the developed countries must give a new 100 billion in resources to the international financial development, multilateral development institutions to facilitate our development and so forth. So, my understanding of today's discussion is that we are discussing on the concept of underdevelopment. And I'm saying that we are applying the reparation principle and concept in a very creative way to how we address issues of structural underdevelopment in the international economic and political order. And those are just some examples. And we need to pay some attention to the Bridgetown Initiative and the effort that is the reparation idea that underpins that initiative that we are currently deploying in a very creative way.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm still wanting to hear more on this issue of the issues of self-repair and what we've heard David did give us some examples of what he thinks it doesn't mean, and it doesn't mean that we're damaged goods in that sense. But tell me, Doc, you have any ideas on this issue of self-repair, and are we good? Are we ready? Do we have more to do? What's the gap?
We have quite a lot more to do, but like David, I really question the terminology itself. I think part of the problem is that we are wedded to the English language. We have to decolonize the English language in order to really, create frameworks of development for ourselves. Part of the problem is our enslavement to the English language. But before I address that, David, I have a different view, and I think I would remain with a different view to you with respect to debt cancellation. Um, I didn't explore more of the 10-point plan because there was more time to explore more. But even if you have 1,000 years to repay and you do not have government that answer to the people, that answer to checks and balances, you're going to have problems. So that's why I talked about governance as well. Governance. So that if you look at systems of governance that are not answerable to the people, answerable even to the parliament or whatever systems you have, the cancellation of debt is not going to redound to any kind of benefit that, let's say, that would lead to the reduction of underdevelopment. And that's why we have what we had. Maurice Bishop had no debt cancellation. He had no reparations. And yet he was able to work within the limitations of the resources he had. Yes, we know that Cuba was at his side, facilitating. But it's a mindset that you come with. No, let me. I remained very quiet when you were speaking. It's the mindset of
I'm not
the
interrupting you.
no. But it's the
I'm not
mindset.
interrupting you unless you don't want me to. You want me to keep my face
No.
absolutely passive.
No. It's a mindset of the leader that is very important, and it speaks to what the question that Asha has asked about self-repair, because self-repair essentially, if we translate it, it amounts to the psychological emancipation of the of ourselves, psychological emancipation. We can talk about mental emancipation, but I use the word psychological emancipation. Intellectual emancipation, the decolonization of the mind, which I also mentioned, and which Beckford also emphasized as the starting point. Because unless you have a new mental framework, you are going to be entrapped in the same system that you think that you are going to defeat. You're going to be trapped within those systems. You have to have a new mindset. The Black Power Revolution was a great contribution towards the intellectual and psychological emancipation of our people. I think more could have been done. More should have been done. The education system should have contributed further to that psychological emancipation. It didn't do much. In fact, the education system we know is part of the problem. But this is how I see it. It is an authentic concern. In fact, our emancipation committee, our National Committee on Reparations, has placed self-repair at the center of the local programs that we are pursuing. Right? So we have launched out, we have fine-tuned a number of projects that we will embark upon, targeting the schools, targeting community groups, and so on. So that is part of our agenda here, outside of the broader CARICOM framework for reparations. But that is part of the CARICOM 10-point plan, but we have made that, central to our own National Reparations Commission. I see Robin is back, and I wanted to ask him a question, not about the contribution, but it suddenly dawned on me when your name was called earlier this evening. I said, wait, I have a textbook with Robin Walker, and I started looking. When we ruled, are you that Robin Walker? I thought you should have been introduced as the author of that great work, which I have right in front of me there. That's a fantastic work, brother. I thank you for writing it. I have benefited a lot from that. Such an enlightening work. And it's part of what our self-repair is all about. We have to look at the contributions of Africa to world civilization. I think David would have hinted at that as well. And you would have explored a lot of that. So now I understand where you were coming from, right? Because the destruction of Africa was not just about the slave trade alone. It went beyond that. But we need to return to an understanding of where we were in world history, what we have done in all of the disciplines that we know about, whether it's mathematics, science, in medicine and calendrics, whatever you talk about, engineering and so on. We need to go back there. That's part of our decolonization that David also positioned as, deconstructing white supremacy, because white supremacy itself is a myth. But how do you engage the myth? How do you take that myth out of your head? Because unless you know how it's going to remain in your head as a drumbeat, right?
Mhm.
And so we need to deal with it. That's all part of what I understand self-repair to be about. Okay,
Ah,
so now that
yes,
Robin is
yes.
back, I give way. I give way.
You give way. Okay, thank you, gentlemen. And I'm going to ask Robin to give us his discussion on self repair. The question, Robin, was what about self repair in this discourse on reparations? And how are our governments faring in leading the charge for self repair? What grade would we give them? Are we about to close off this decade of the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent without having address this issue of self repair? And let me just say this before I give you the floor, forgive me. And that is one of the reasons I thought that this 25th anniversary of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series should have as its theme the movement for decolonization continues, because our mind. Go ahead, my brother.
Yeah, our view, I represent a company called The Black Secret. Our view is that when it comes to self repair, it has to be on the basis of a sound knowledge of our history, because once you can lay a historical foundation, you can build all the other areas of knowledge on that foundation. And our governments have had an opportunity to actually take advantage of this type of information, because it will rewrite what our universities teach about history. It will rewrite what our universities teach about the human sciences. So when we're dealing with the human sciences, the sociologists, the psychologists, the economists, the people engaged in business studies and so on, we can revolutionize all of these teachings based on our historical experiences. When it comes to the natural sciences, the contributions of Black people to them, be it physics, be it chemistry, be it biology, have been sterling contributions, if only we knew. And consequently, the opportunity has been there for a while, because Black people have created modern semi-independent governments with enough independence where we could have changed the education system. Now, my company, the Black Secret, we are about that. And we are about making that information available to Black people all over the world, where people can come and study this kind of heritage. But it shouldn't have come from us. It should have come from our governments. So when it comes to then the teaching of psychology, Monsieur Frantz Fanon, with his book, Black Skins, White Masks, he began the revolution. He continued it with the likes of The Wretched of the Earth. That should have been the basis of Black psychology. Then you can bring in African American scholars, the likes of Naim Akbar, the likes of Professor Linda Myers, etc., 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 all people that have revolutionized the study of the African mind. Then when it comes to sociology, we have a tradition of African American sociologists going back to W.E.B. Du Bois. And you also have Professor Sheikh Anta Diop with his book, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa. Oba Shaka's book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, which would then give us an understanding of the Black family. We could also have revolutionized in the areas of business and economics through George Sabira's Black Folks Guide to Making Big Money in America, Jawanza Kunjufu's Black Economics, and then, of course, Caribbean intellectuals such as the legendary William Arthur Lewis. So consequently, when it comes to how we could have changed the teaching of these subjects, the opportunities have been there. And certainly we doing this at the Black Secret. And our challenge to the African and Caribbean governments is to do the same. But let me say one final thing about self-repair. Self-repair is important and we should do it, but let's not lose the major point, which is the colonial and enslaving powers need to have pressure put on them to cut the check.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. Very, very excellent. I just want to add that in this whole discourse on self repair, that when I say that, I'm not just looking at the individual, although, of course, we have to change our mental understanding and our psychological understanding of where we sit. But I'm thinking, as I think I heard that term come, and maybe it came from Dr. Fergus, he said governance. I would say we said the education system. I'm saying the system of criminal justice. That needs self-repair. Why are we waiting for somebody else to do it for us? The whole political systems, the way in which we manage the environment. David raised that. We don't need someone else to come in and tell us how to do that.
No, but with all due respect, Asha, these
Yes.
are things that our governments work on a daily basis.
Yes,
when we talk about
they're
education,
working on it, David. But from what mindset? From what mindset are they working on?
Hold on. For example, in education, we
Yes.
established a Caribbean Examination Council way back in the early 1970s. We have been working on.
After the Black Power Revolution, David. After
Hold on.
the Black Power Revolution, our government said, okay, these guys are saying something right. But have they advanced it? Have they deepened it? Why? The question would be, why up to today must our children be still learning some of the most foolish things that, that the indigenous people were cannibals, that Christopher Columbus came and discovered us?
Our
The
children
question is,
learn that,
yes.
Asher, with all due respect, our children do not learn that. We do ourselves a disservice if we speak as though our academics, our intellectuals, our educators have done nothing, and that we have just stagnated for 50 years. We are doing ourselves a disservice if we speak like that. Yes,
I agree with
there are
you.
deficiencies in our work, but we always have to acknowledge and recognize the work of our own people and the progress that we have made. So let's be very clear about that.
I agree with you, but we can't whitewash it.
Caribbean studies. We have scholars like Dr. Fergus.
Of course. Like yourself. But listen, that's why I said, what grade would we give them? The people, have to be willing to push, because if we don't push, then our leaders don't move.
Well, this is how
on their own. No leader moves on their own because they are caught in a political system that is very short-sighted. Now, there may be exceptions. I'm not saying there are no exceptions to the rule, but there are the majority. We are caught in a political system of short-sightedness because of the way the political system works.
I just want to warn us. I just want to warn us to be wary of this tendency that I think we have to look at ourselves and be hypercritical, to speak as though we have done nothing good, we have achieved nothing, we are going nowhere. I just want to, that's a tendency that we have to be very careful about. Yes, we need to be self-critical, but we need to do that within a realistic context of acknowledging our own work and our own progress. Now, in terms of governance, reparations is a very creative concept, and the concept of reparations could be and should be used in a very creative way by reparations activists and by our citizens to hold our governments accountable. Because if an African or Caribbean government says that it is part of a reparations campaign, it is claiming reparations from the European governments, and it is doing so on the basis that these Europeans committed crimes and injustices against African people, and that is the basis of the reparations claim, then it is a fundamental contradiction for that same government to commit injustices and crimes against its own Black people. So reparations is a concept that reparations activists and conscious members of the population have to deploy, not only against the European governments, but against our own governments as well, to hold them accountable and to insist that they do right and they do justice to their own Black or African citizens.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to take the privilege of the chair.
Let's bring in the audience. Let's bring in the audience. We haven't heard from the audience yet.
That's right. We've got some questions, and interestingly, one of the questions that came from the audience is that they asked, they said, based on what we're talking about development, and this is what I think our brother Walker was just saying. That's why I didn't bring it up, because I think our brother Walker just answered it in a sense. They said, shouldn't we be, why are we just tracing it backwards to slavery? And shouldn't we be going from period of enslavement? The person is asking, instead of just going from slavery to forward, shouldn't we be tracing backwards and then letting us understand what our development was before the period of enslavement alone? He was asking, should that be the point of demarcation? Or should we not look at how we lived in essence before that, what our achievements were before that? I think that's what this, one of the questions here. But I think Mr. Robin Walker was giving us some insight into the way in which those things come together, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I don't think any of us now in the Pan-African movement look at the slave trade as a point of departure, except in terms of the disruption of African achievements, African civilizations. We don't do that. So I think the questioner should rest assured that when we market our own history, we begin from the beginning. In fact, when I taught African history at UWI, the beginning of our history goes so far back to the beginning of humankind, because Africa was the cradle of not only civilization, but the birthplace of humanity. So it's a very, very long history that goes so far back before enslavement that the period from enslavement to now would not even be fit into that space, because it's so tiny. It's such a tiny frame of reference, really. It is an important juncture, because it would have created a different diaspora, a new diaspora, the diaspora of Africa. And that's another thing we need to learn. The African diaspora didn't start with the Atlantic slave trade. You know, the African diaspora began over 1 million years ago, because it is the Africans who would have settled across Asia, as far as Australia, New Zealand. And there's evidence of Africans for many, many thousands of years before the arrival of the people we call the first peoples, that Africans were here. There's evidence, archaeological evidence in Brazil, for example, for an earlier presence of Africans on the American continent than the first people. So I don't think we should be bothered about that at all. And I think, as I said, you know, as Robin is there, I think people should get a hold of that book, and they're going to benefit from it. There are lots of illustrations. It was one of my foundation books. In fact, I have it right in front of me, alongside Sheikh Anta Diop, Benjo Cannon, you know, all of the greats. You know, that book is alongside those. So that is where I locate that particular work. You want to understand the longer history of Africa? I'm not saying that's the only book to look at, but it's a beautiful work because it's easy reading as well. And a lot of images in it, you know, that, you know, people who know nothing, you approach tabula rasa on African history, you're going to learn a lot. a lot of visuals in that book. So, as I said, it's a great contribution that he has made to our knowledge of Africa, with a focus, of course, from the title, When We Ruled. So you can have an idea that he's looking at achievements, African achievements, and not at all about the slave trade or post-slave trade. He's looking at Africa at the height of its greatness, when we ruled. Yes. But Robin is back, so I think he can
Good,
speak.
thank you. Right, we still have a few moments left. So before we actually close off our afternoon, I want to give every speaker an opportunity to sort of wade in on their last key points, something maybe they think they've missed, or something they'd like the audience to leave as a critical point of departure here before we close off this afternoon session, because really it's been such an exciting time. The time has just flown. So where shall I start? Mr. Robin, maybe Robin Walker, maybe since you've just joined us back, would you like to say some? Yes, please.
Yeah, just the main point that enslaved Africans were not just dumb labor. And a lot of the talk about reparations is as if they were dumb labor, as if they were farmers and that's it. The full contribution of our heritage and contribution to civilization, even as enslaved people, has been incredible, and people need to know this. So during mass enslavement, you had one African named is called Juan Latino, captured and enslaved in Spain and became professor of Latin in 16th century Spain. Another African captured and enslaved, Abraham Hannibal, and he ended up as generalissimo in the Russian army. And his palace, number 29 Street, St. Petersburg, is still there. His summer palace in Petroskoe, still there. Another African captured and enslaved, Wilhelm Ammo, ends up as professor of philosophy at the University of Jena in Germany. These sorts of achievements people need to know. And that's what me and my company, we are called The Black Secret. So people listening, check us out, theblacksecret.co.uk. We are about teaching that type of heritage. And until our governments fully embrace that heritage, we are among the people that you need to check out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walker. Anyone else wants to weigh in on their last comments? David, do we start with you?
Let me make my last comment, because I would like David to wrap up the session.
Okay.
Yeah, I refer to his status as such an eminent Pan-Africanist, reparationist. So I just want to say briefly that underdevelopment should not ever be accepted as our fate or our destiny, but an accident of our history, which must be corrected. Now, in European philosophy and law, private property was elevated to an inalienable right, but they subjugated us, reduced us to private property or chattel. And I am saying that if private property is an inalienable right, the right to reparations should also be an inalienable right, not only for African people, but for all those whose ancestors lived under the boot of European oppression and violence. That's my closing remark. Over to you, Madam.
Thank you very much. Just before I ask Ambassador David Commission to wind us, to bring us home, as they say, Mr. Walker, someone has, one of our colleagues on the question comments there has said they want to give you an opportunity to sort of rectify something that you said, which was that farmers might have been treated as dumb laborers. And this person wants to assure everyone in the audience that, in fact, you couldn't have meant that farmers who produce all the food that we eat and sustain us, in fact, were ever just dumb laborers. I think you meant that's the way they perceived us.
That's the way we've been presented.
Okay, right. Okay. Ambassador Commission, the floor is yours now.
Thanks, Asha. I just want to reiterate something I said at the beginning when I gave the definition of reparations, that reparations must, as far as possible, wipe out all the consequences of the illegal act and re-establish the situation which would, in all probability, have existed if that act had not been committed. And so we definitely can't begin with enslavement. We begin with the Africa that existed before the commencement of the transatlantic slave trade. And all of the historical records tell us that certainly at a material level, those African societies were on par, if not superior, to the societies of Western Europe. So we know that is where we began. And the definition of reparations tells us we began with that situation of material equality at the very least. And the reparations concept tells us that we must now restore that situation. We went through those centuries of systematic underdevelopment of Africa and African people on the one hand, and European development on the other hand. We must now restore that balance. And I want to support the point that Robin Walker was making. The truth is that the European Industrial Revolution began on the plantations of the Caribbean. In the 1640s, there were no factories in Europe. If you wanted to find a factory in the 1640s, you had to come to places like Barbados. That sugar industry with the canes of field to grow the sugar cane, the windmill to grind sugar cane into cane juice, the sugar factory or boiling house to put that cane juice through various chemical and heating processes to produce molasses, sugar, rum. That was the beginning of Europe's industrial revolution. And who ran those boiling houses? Who ran that proto-industrial economy? They called them slaves. But when you look behind that name slave, what you see is blacksmith, carpenter, cooper, boiler. In other words, it was enslaved Africans who ran that proto-industrial economy. And many of them came with the skills from Africa. How do we know that? We know that because the historical evidence has demonstrated that a disproportionate number of the carpenters, for example, on the slave plantation were African-born people. In other words, they brought the skill with them from Africa. So it is our skill, our intelligence that set Europe on the path to its industrial revolution. As Mr. Walker is saying, not just the fact that they deprived our ancestors of appropriating any of the fruits of their labor, but also that they benefited from the intellectual skills and capacity of our people. So reparations are due. A lot is due to us. We are a miracle people. We have done relatively well. We have created, in the Caribbean for sure, we have created nurturing and relatively progressive societies with very little. We know that much was taken from us, much was denied us, and much is now due to us. And if we can get what is due to us, we will really see what we are capable of, the kind of development that we are truly capable of. We miracle people.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much, Mr. Walker. Thank you very much, Dr. Fergus. And thank you, audience. I think it's been a very, very stimulating discussion this evening, and I think we are well placed for we've done Kwame well, let's put it that way, in our discussion on reparations. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next week at the same time as we continue discussions. There next week we will be looking at young people talking to us about music and culture and violence. Look out for us. Thank you very much again.